Hello, in this video, I'm going to talk about whether it's okay to lie to your therapist and the three misrepresentations that we strongly discourage. So stay tuned. Welcome to Wellness with John. I'm John Peters, and these are resources to help you thrive. And this video is part 3 of my series on things that we therapists don't tell you. Okay. So if you haven't seen the first 2 parts, I will put a link up here to part 1 if you want to go back and start there. But I made this series after making another video, which was what to expect in your first therapy session. And that caused me to think, well, there are lots of things we could say in the first therapy session. There are lots of things that we want to say to people, but we don't really labor the process with. But there are these common issues that come up for people in different ways with different patients, but very common. And so there's this domain of questions or things that we therapists kind of end up addressing in one way or another with patients, but we don't necessarily have a big opening spiel where we cover all this. So this is why I'm making this series of videos, because I think these things are generally informative. Hopefully it's informative for you. And you can learn something about how to get good quality therapy if you're in therapy. And we therapists can also, on the other end, feel assured that you are well informed and have a good understanding of what the therapy process is. Okay. And by the way, if you like this kind of content, hit the like button below, please. And if you have yet to subscribe to the channel, please subscribe because I'd love to have more subscribers for my channel, right? So anyway, so in this video, I want to talk about is it okay to lie to your therapist? And this isn't really a question that people ask, but I think that it relates to the choice that people make about how they ought to be and how they choose to be open with their therapist. And in the video where I talked about the confusion about what type of person is this therapist dude in my life or person, woman in my life, um, in terms of the type of relationship, part of what we understand when we know how to relate to someone is where are the boundaries, right? And my opinion about privacy is that even in our closest relationships, so partners, family members, children, therapists, even in our closest relationships in our lives, privacy is a part of how we assert healthy autonomy. Okay. There are people in the camp that believe, radical honesty, radical openness is the way to go. That is not my attitude. I think that we have our own private inner lives, some of which we don't share with anyone else on the planet, or we share very selectively. Okay. So that's my attitude. That's privacy is healthy. And privacy on the part of you as a patient in a therapy relationship with a therapist also is healthy. It's not the case that there's a rule that you have to be absolutely open about every possible thing with your therapist because some things are just either tangential or don't matter at all. Some things the therapist doesn't actually need to know in order to know you well as a patient and to be able to serve you in their role. Okay. But and this comes up, I think, a little bit probably for patients in the sense that we therapists do often ask a lot of very personal questions from the get-go. So even in the very first session that you have with your therapist, they're likely to ask you some things that are generally private and sensitive that you may not be sharing with anybody else. We ask things like about your substance abuse. We ask about suicidality. We ask about your history, what medications you're on, lots of details about how you're functioning. A lot of that is very personal, private information that you might not be sharing with people, even people relatively close to you, right? So the fact that we are focusing on private, very personal, sensitive information doesn't mean, again, that there's a rule that you actually have to be wide open with no sense of privacy in the therapy relationship, right? It's still okay for you to have healthy autonomy partly by having your own private life, right? So I think that some patients who are more private and more guarded in how they get along in the world probably are a little reticent to access therapy services for this reason, because they don't want to feel as exposed, even with someone who's relatively trustworthy or they could trust, because they want to be private, you know? So I'm saying that's okay. Okay. It's okay to maintain your privacy, but there are three types of things that we therapists strongly discourage you from misrepresenting to your therapist. Okay. Number one is your symptoms that are relevant to the thing that you're coming to therapy to address. You don't want to understate them or overstate them. Okay. So, for example, if someone goes to therapy because they're anxious, and the therapist is likely to ask questions about the type of anxiety, you know, when it shows up, how you experience it, things you've done to try to ameliorate it, and things. And so we ask all sorts of questions to get a really good understanding of the nature of your anxiety. And you don't really want to overstate or understate or leave out important information about that very thing, because that's a central point of focus for the therapy process in terms of trying to help you improve your status. So you don't want to overstate or understate symptoms and magnitude of symptoms and things like that. So be honest about what you're experiencing in terms of whatever it is: anxiety, sleep disturbance, mood issues, irritability, whatever the thing is that the therapist might be asking about that's germane to what you're wanting to get out of therapy. You know, be as honest with that as you can. Number two is you want to be honest about um, features of suicidality, because you know, the therapist does not have a crystal ball to see into your life and to see the things that you might not share. We therapists are limited in our knowledge of a patient. We can just see how the patient presents in the sessions, and we can see, you know, what the patient is handing us in terms of their narrative, what their story, and what they're telling us about their life. We don't usually have a lot of collateral information in a case to have external ways to triangulate on the validity of what we're seeing in a case. So we're kind of relying on just what the patient's reporting and how they're presenting in the session. We can't magically know certain things that we might want to know. For example, what's the person's relative safety risk of harming themselves? So it's important, not only when your therapist asks direct questions about suicidal ideation, that you're honest about that, but that even if the therapist is not asking in a given moment, and that's something that is relevant that you ought to share, you should share that, because you know, part of the therapist's role is to support you in staying safe, and that does at times include addressing suicidal ideation and safety. And so you are robbing the therapist of their proper role of supporting your safety if you hide suicidal ideation, right? Some people worry that if they say they're suicidal, that means the therapist is going to immediately pick up the phone and call an ambulance for them, and they'll get you know, sent to an inpatient psychiatric ward in a hospital, or that there'll be other consequences. This is not generally the case. You know, there are times where, as a therapist, I have called for a wellness check. There's times with the patient's permission, I have called for extra assistance because they're an imminent threat to themselves. But you know, it's not the case that if you reveal that you have suicidal ideation, that you automatically minutes later are going to be in a psychiatric ward, right? If that were true, quite a, you know, large number of people in the United States would be inpatient psych right now, because suicidal ideation is actually a relatively common thing, especially in the context of depression, right? But the reality is that suicidal ideation can be managed in the outpatient setting. It doesn't mean you're immediately going to be put in a hospital. Um, but it's a very, very important thing for you to be honest about with your therapist so that your therapist can be in the best position to support you in staying safe, right? And ameliorating your depression or whatever is related to the suicidal ideation or coping with a challenging life event, things like that. So be honest about suicidal ideation. The third type of thing that people commonly misrepresent to therapists is substance use. And some people, I think, again, are reticent to be honest about it because they're worried about, consequences. Like if I say that I'm using drugs, the therapist is going to call the police on me. You should know that we therapists are not bound to report crimes. Even if someone says I'm a drug dealer, we're not bound to call the police and report them as a drug dealer. There are some crimes like murder. There are some threats for crimes like the intent to harm another person that we would be legally bound to report. But, the reality is that the privacy regulations actually protect you as a patient, even if you do something that we think is illegal or we think is wrong. We're not morally or legally bound to follow up on that, except in the cases that would trump that, including safety issues, including neglect and abuse of a minor or a an elderly dependent, things like that. But the thing is that people often are reticent to be honest about their substance use. And this is why in therapy for decades, there's this rule of thumb that people go by, which is whenever someone says the first answer to the question, how much alcohol do you drink per week, that we multiply that times 3, and that's the real answer. And the reason we do that is that when we work in a case, not just for one session, but we have an ongoing relationship with a patient who uses alcohol, it is actually very common that they eventually reveal that they lied to us initially and that they're actually using quite a lot more than they initially said. In cases where we do have collateral information, it's often revealed that whatever they said initially to the questions about drug and alcohol use, that was not true, and that it ends up being a lot more later. The problem with that, of course, is that a lot of people are honest about those questions. And so we can't assume that whatever the person said, that 3 times that is actually accurate, right? It's just that often it's a lot more. And why is it a lot more? Because people lie about it. And people lie about it either because they don't want to face consequences related to it, or that they're minimizing it in themselves and they really just don't want to confront the issue of their drug use. But one reason that it's very important to be honest about substance use is that when people use substances, they interact with the very things that people are coming to therapy to address. And what I mean by that is that some substance use can exacerbate and make worse mental health issues, even though people often use substances to self medicate from the misery of chronic mental health issues. But the reality is that some substances can make those worse. And the other thing is that even if you're not, altered by a substance at the time of the therapy session, the use of substances in lots of cases, especially particular types of substances, can actually cause a person to present as mentally ill in a way that the therapist wouldn't give an accurate evaluation if they didn't know about the substance abuse, right? So, for example, if someone is using a lot of stimulant substances, nicotine, caffeine, methamphetamine, crack cocaine, and they're complaining of anxiety, right? But they don't say anything about the substance use at all. Then the evaluation of the therapist on the severity and type of anxiety that the person has is going to be completely off, because the symptoms that people are exhibiting or reporting have to be understood in the context of their general well-being and whether there are other factors like drugs or like medical conditions that reasonably could explain why the person is presenting the way that they are. So when people are dishonest about substance use, you're really skewing the perceptions of the person who's trying to accurately evaluate you in order to figure out what an appropriate treatment plan could be to help address your goals in therapy. So definitely be honest about substance use, whatever it happens to be. This is true of illegal substances, legal substances, pharmaceuticals, over-the-counter stuff, whatever you're using that the therapist asks about. Be honest about that, because if you're not, you're really undermining the quality of what you're going to get out of the therapist, and you're pointing the therapist really in a wrong direction in terms of both their evaluation and what they're going to try to do to treat you for whatever it is you're presenting with, right? And I get that there are reservations about these different types of things for the reasons that I explained, but again, as I explained, there are good reasons to try to be honest about those things. Otherwise, if you're generally guarded about your private life and there are things that you don't want to reveal at first until you trust the therapist more, that's fine. It's just that when there are these crucial things that have to do with the very fundamental aspects of your safety, your well-being, or the quality of the process, it's important for you to be honest with your therapist, right? Otherwise, is it okay to lie to your therapist? Sure. I'm not your ethicist. I'm not your clergy. I can't speak to it from a moral standpoint, but from the practical standpoint, those are the reasons to be honest, at least about those three types of things. So again, if you like this type of video, hit the like button, please subscribe. And also know that I'm not sponsored by anybody. And I do have a way, if you want to work with me a little more closely through an online course. I have a course, Stress Reduction Mastery, which is a 2-week course where you can learn, easy to practice techniques that start producing really quick results to lower your stress and anxiety from day one. And they're the types of techniques, and it's the type of advice that actually helps you have not just quick results, but lasting results, because it helps to rewire your stress reaction so that you have improved stress performance out into the future. So it gives you a type of brain fitness. And the good news about that course is that I've taught this material to thousands of people at this point because I've been in practice for 25 years. And so I have 100% confidence that they work because I see these techniques work with people over and over. And so if you take the course and you decide that they don't work for you, just send me a message and it's 100% guaranteed. I'll just give you all your money back because I know that they work. So if you take the course, you're going to get improvement. If you happen to take the course and you don't, I'll just give you your money back, right? So thanks for joining me in this video today, and I will see you in the next part in this series. The topic is yet to be determined, but I'll see you there. Thanks.